Let me tell you about a Saturday evening in October of 1976 on the high, windswept plains of the Texas Panhandle, when a 74-year-old cattleman in a faded blue chambray workshirt walked into the Cattleman Steakhouse on Cuyler Street in Comanche Wells, Texas, to eat his anniversary supper at the booth where he had eaten his anniversary supper every October for 52 years, and was told very politely and very firmly that he would not be seated for dinner. The man's name was Cyrus Sutterfield. Everyone in Hutchinson County called him Cy, the way everyone had called his father Marcus and his grandfather Lawton and his great-grandfather Asa, in the long and unbroken Sutterfield line of men who had grazed cattle on the buffalo grass country east of the Canadian River since the autumn of 1881. The Sutterfield Ranch sat on 4,200 acres of mostly red roan rangeland 22 miles east of Comanche Wells, with a low spring-fed creek running through the south pasture and a stand of cottonwoods around the home place that had been planted by Cy's grandmother in 1893. The cattle were Hereford and crossed Hereford Angus and had been for 45 years. Cy ran approximately 400 head most years. He had been running cattle on that ground since the autumn of 1919, when he was 17 years old, and his father had handed him a saddle and told him the south pasture was his to look after now. He had married Iola Wesley in the Comanche Wells Methodist Church on Saturday, October 18th, 1924. She had been a tall, brown-eyed school teacher from Pampa, the daughter of a country veterinarian. They had met at a church social in Pampa in the summer of 1922. They had courted for 2 years. They had been married for 45 years when Iola was diagnosed with stomach cancer in February of 1969 at the age of 63. And they had been married for 45 years and 4 months when she died at home in their bed on the morning of Friday, June 20th, 1969, with Cy holding her right hand and the wind moving the lace curtain at the window. They had had no children. They had had each other. After Iola died, Cy had not slept in any other bed in the house. He had not in 7 years sat in her chair at the kitchen table. He had not in 7 years removed her hairbrush from the top of the dresser in the bedroom. Every year on the Saturday closest to their wedding anniversary, since the year of their marriage in 1924, Cy and Iola had eaten supper at the Cattleman Steakhouse. On the corner of Cuyler Street and Texas Highway 60 in downtown Comanche Wells, in the back booth on the west wall, under the framed black and white photograph of the Steakhouse's 1922 opening day. The back booth had been theirs from the very first night, because the very first night, Saturday, October 18th, 1924, the kitchen had run a half-portion ribeye special for newlyweds, and Otis Bracewell, the proprietor, had walked them to that booth himself and refused to take their $2 payment. The booth had been theirs every October ever since. After Iola died, Cy had kept going alone. He sat on her side of the booth by the wall, where he could see the framed photograph above his head when he tipped his eyes up. He ordered the ribeye she had always ordered him. He drank his coffee black. He paid in cash. He left the same generous tip he had been leaving since 1948. He did this every October for 7 years. What Cy Sutterfield was, in addition to a Hutchinson County cattleman with 4,200 acres of paid clear rangeland and a herd of approximately 400 Hereford Cross cows, was the owner of the brick storefront at 312 Cuyler Street in downtown Comanche Wells, in which the Cattleman Steakhouse had operated continuously since the spring of 1922. The building had been built in 1908 by Cy's father, Marcus Sutterfield, as a mercantile, had served as a mercantile until 1921, and had then been leased in the spring of 1922 to a returning Great War veteran named Otis Bracewell on a 5-year ground floor lease at $40 a month to open as a steakhouse and saloon. Marcus Sutterfield and Otis Bracewell had shaken hands on the lease in the empty mercantile on a Wednesday afternoon in March of 1922, with Otis's hat in his left hand and Marcus's hat on a nail behind the counter. The lease had been renewed in 1927, 1932, 1937, 1942, 1947, 1952, 1957, 1962, 1967, and 1972. The current lease, a 5-year instrument running from November the 1st, 1971 to October the 31st, 1976, was the 11th consecutive renewal of the original 1922 agreement. The rent in 1976 was $310 a month. The Sutterfield family had owned the building for 54 years. The Bracewell family had run the steakhouse out of it for 54 years. For 54 years, the lease had been renewed every 5 years on a single page, typed on Marcus Sutterfield's old Underwood typewriter, and then on Cy Sutterfield's old Underwood typewriter, and then most recently on Cy's secretary's IBM Selectric, and signed in pencil by Cy and in fountain pen by whichever Bracewell happened to be running the house at a time. There had never been any difficulty. There had never been any negotiation. Cy and Otis had been friends. Cy and Otis's son, Calvin, had been friends. Cy and Calvin had renewed the lease on a handshake in October of 1971 over a piece of cobbler in the back booth, with the paperwork following by mail the following week. In the spring of 1974, Calvin Bracewell, then 68 years old and recently widowed himself, had sold the operating business of the Cattleman Steakhouse to a Dallas corporation called Lone Star Hospitality, Incorporated, which was in the business of acquiring small-town family restaurants across the Panhandle and the Hill Country and converting them into a regional chain concept. Calvin had retained a small minority interest and a contractual role as regional ambassador, which mostly meant he came in on Friday afternoons and shook hands with old customers. Cy had been mildly sad about the sale. He had not objected. The building was his. The lease was his. The operation was Calvin's to dispose of. In May of 1976, 18 months after the sale, Lone Star Hospitality had installed a new general manager at the Cattleman Steakhouse, a young man named Brett Holleran, age 33, formerly of an upscale Houston chop house called the Magnolia Club. Brett Holleran had arrived in Comanche Wells with his wife, Caroline, age 30, who had been installed as the new dining room hostess. They had moved into a rental house on Lipscomb Street. They had been on the job approximately 5 months on the Saturday evening of October the 16th, 1976. In those 5 months, Brett Holleran had done several things. He had brought in a chef from Houston. He had replaced the original menu, which had carried the same dozen items since 1922, with what he called an elevated menu of New York strip. dry-aged ribeye, oysters Rockefeller, and a wine list with 28 bottles. He had pulled the framed 1922 opening day photograph off the back wall and put it in a storage closet behind the kitchen. He had pulled the framed black and white photograph of Otis Bracewell and Marcus Sutterfield shaking hands in front of the Mercantile in 1922 off the wall by the front door and put that in the storage closet too. And he had instituted, 2 weeks before Si's anniversary, a printed dress code posted in a brass frame just inside the front door, requiring that gentlemen at the dinner hour wear a sport coat, blazer, or tailored Western jacket of suitable presentation. Si Sutterfield, on the Saturday evening of October the 16th, 1976, did not know about the dress code. He had not been in the Cattleman's Steakhouse since the previous October, when he had eaten his 51st anniversary supper, alone at the back booth with Calvin Bracewell sitting briefly across from him to say hello. He had heard from his foreman, Earl Dobbs, in passing, that the new manager from Houston had tightened things up, but Earl Dobbs had not said anything about coats, and Si had not asked. He dressed for it, the way he had always dressed for it. He took down from the wardrobe in the bedroom the faded blue chambray workshirt that Iola had given him for his 50th birthday in May of 1952 on a Sunday afternoon in Pampa, wrapped in brown butcher paper and a length of red yarn she had unwound from her own knitting basket. He buttoned it up to the second from the top button. He tucked it into a clean pair of dark blue Levi's that had been washed but not pressed. He put on the good belt with the silver Comanche Wells stock show buckle he had won as a young man in 1928 for a calf roping prize. He pulled on his work boots, which were the only boots he owned, and which he polished black every Friday night. He put on his late father's gray wool vest, which Marcus Sutterfield had bought in Amarillo in 1939, and Iola had taken in at the back in 1956. He set his good silver belly Stetson on his head. He drove the 22 miles west to Comanche Wells in his 1968 Chevrolet C20 pickup in the long, high plains October dusk, with the cottonwoods along the highway going pale yellow. He pulled into the angle parking on Cuyler Street at 6:22 in the evening. He locked the truck. He walked the half block to the brick storefront at 312 Cuyler. He pushed the heavy oak door open. He stepped into the entry vestibule with the brass bell on a chain overhead and the gas lamp wall sconces and the long mahogany hostess station that Otis Bracewell had built himself out of native pecan in 1922. Behind the station, in a black satin floor-length dress with a strand of cultured pearls, stood Caroline Holleran. She looked up from a leather reservation book. She looked Cyrus Sutterfield over from his good silver belly Stetson down through his late father's gray wool vest, his faded blue chambray workshirt, his unpressed Levi's, his work boots. She did not smile. "Good evening, sir." "Evening, ma'am. Sutterfield. Back booth, 6:30. Caroline Holleran looked down at the leather reservation book. She made a small show of running her finger down the page. She looked back up. "I do see your name, Mr. Sutterfield. I'm afraid, however, that the dress code at the dinner hour requires a sport coat, blazer, or tailored Western jacket. I'm so sorry, sir." Si Sutterfield stood very still. He could see, past Caroline Holleran's shoulder, through the open archway into the long dining room, the back booth on the west wall. The booth was empty. The framed 1922 opening day photograph was not above it. There was a small framed advertisement for a Houston bourbon company instead. "Ma'am." "Yes, sir. This is my wife's shirt. She gave it to me 24 years ago. I have been eating my supper in that back booth on the third Saturday in October for 52 years. I understand, sir. The dress code, however." "Where is Calvin Bracewell?" "Mr. Bracewell is no longer involved in day-to-day operations of the establishment. May I phone a cab or arrange for—" "Where is the manager?" Caroline Holleran turned, and Brett Holleran was already there in the dining room doorway, having heard the conversation from inside. He was dressed in a charcoal blazer and a French blue dress shirt and a navy tie. He had a small, carefully trimmed, sandy mustache. He smiled the careful smile of a man trained in hotel administration. "Mr. Sutterfield, Brett Holleran, I'm so glad to meet you. I do apologize about the dress code. We've made some adjustments in the past few months as we elevate the experience here. I'd be happy to comp you a dinner to go this evening, or to arrange a reservation for next Saturday if you can bring a coat. It would be our honor." Across the dining room by the kitchen door, May Crocker, 66 years old, head waitress of the Cattleman Steakhouse since the autumn of 1938, who had served Cy and Iola their anniversary rib-eye every October from 1948 through 1968, was standing with a coffee pot in her hand, staring straight at Cy. May Crocker did not move. She had been told in a staff meeting on Monday morning that the dining room floor was the general manager's purview and that waitstaff would not interfere with seating decisions. May Crocker was a widow herself. She had 4 grandchildren in Comanche Wells public schools. She kept her hands on the coffee pot. Cy looked at May for a long moment. May looked back. Neither said anything. Cy turned to Brett Holleran. "I will not be having supper this evening, Mr. Holleran. Good night to you. Good night to you, ma'am." He turned. He walked back out through the vestibule under the brass bell on its chain, past the place on the wall by the front door, where the 1922 handshake photograph had been for 54 years and was no longer out the heavy oak door, down the brick steps. He walked to the C-20 pickup. He sat in the cab for 1 minute with his hands on the wheel and his Stetson in his lap and his eyes on the brick storefront across the street that had been his father's mercantile and was now his building. He did not weep. He did not curse. He did not say one word out loud. He drove the 22 miles back east to the Sutterfield home place in the long, high plains, October dark. He pulled into the gravel turnaround at the bunkhouse a few minutes past 7. He walked into the kitchen. Earl Dobbs was sitting at the table with his hat off, drinking a cup of coffee. Cy's housekeeper, a 48-year-old Mexican-American woman named Rosalva Ortega, had left on the warming plate. Earl Dobbs looked up. He saw Cy's face. He said, "Me, Cy." "Earl, you're back early." "I am." Cy did not sit down at the table. He walked through the kitchen into the front room. He opened the bottom drawer of the roll-top desk that had belonged to his father, Marcus, and pulled out a leather portfolio labeled in his own hand, 312 Cuyler, leases, 1922 to 1976. He carried it back into the kitchen. He sat down in his own chair at the head of the table. He laid the portfolio on the oilcloth. Earl Dobbs watched him. "Earl." "Yes, Cy." "They wouldn't seat me." Earl Dobbs set his coffee cup down slowly. "Brett. And his wife. May was there. May was there. She was told to keep her hands on the coffee pot." Earl Dobbs put both his hands flat on the oilcloth. He was 62 years old and had worked for the Sutterfield Ranch for 35 years. And he had loved Iola Sutterfield in the chaste and respectful way an older ranch hand loves the rancher's wife since 1941. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to drive me to Pampa Monday morning, to Buck Pruitt's office, 8 o'clock. "Buck Pruitt?" "Yes." Earl Dobbs nodded. He picked up his coffee cup. He drank what was left. That night, Cy Sutterfield sat at the kitchen table in his late wife's chair, on her side of the table, with the leather portfolio open in front of him, and the kitchen lamp on overhead, and the wind moving the lace curtain at the window, the way it had moved the lace curtain at the bedroom window on the morning Iola died. He read every page of every lease the family had executed with the Bracewells from the spring of 1922 to the autumn of 1971. He read the original 1922 lease in his father Marcus's hand. He read the 10 subsequent renewals. He read the current lease, dated November the 1st, 1971, signed in pencil by Cyrus Sutterfield, lessor, and in fountain pen by Calvin Bracewell, lessee, with a typed schedule of rents and the standard one-page boilerplate Marcus Sutterfield had drafted in 1927, and that had been used in every subsequent renewal without change. The boilerplate provided that the lease term was 5 years, that the rent was payable on the 1st of each month, that improvements were the lessees, that the lease was renewable for additional 5-year terms upon the mutual written agreement of both parties, that absent such mutual written agreement, the lease would terminate by operation of law at midnight on the last day of the original term, that there was no automatic renewal, that there was no holdover tenancy, that continued occupation past the termination date constituted trespass, and the lessor was entitled to immediate possession. Marcus Sutterfield, in 1927, had been a careful man. Cy Sutterfield, in 1976, was a careful man, too. He closed the portfolio. He sat for a long time. He looked across the table at the empty chair where Iola had sat. He said very quietly, "I'm sorry, honey. I should have brought you the ribeye home tonight. I'm sorry." He went to bed at 11. He slept 7 hours. On Sunday morning, he got up at 6, fed the dogs, drove out to the south pasture with Earl in the C-20, looked at the herd, came home for lunch, sat in the front room after lunch, and read the Amarillo Globe News. And at 4 in the afternoon called the home number of Hollis Pruitt, attorney at law, of Pampa, Texas, who had been his lawyer and his father's lawyer and was the grandson of his grandfather's lawyer. "Buck, Cy, I need to come up Monday morning to talk about the Cuyler Street lease." There was a small pause on the other end. Buck Pruitt was 68 years old. He had been admitted to the Texas bar in 1932. He had drawn the 1957, 1962, 1967, and 1972 renewals. 8 o'clock? 8 o'clock? I'll have the file. "Buck." "Yes, Si. It expires October 31st. "I know it does. They wouldn't seat me last night." There was a longer pause. Buck Pruitt, who had also known Iola Sutterfield since 1924, who had drawn her will in 1962 and probated it in 1969, said in the careful, even voice of a small-town Texas attorney who has watched a great many things in his life, "I'll have the file pulled by 8, Si." Buck Pruitt's office occupied the second floor of a two-story limestone building on Cuyler Street in Pampa, 3 blocks east of the Hutchinson County Courthouse. By 8 on Monday morning, October the 18th, 1976, which was, Cy realized as he climbed the wooden stairs, the actual 52nd anniversary of his wedding to Iola. Cy was sitting in the brown leather wingback chair across from Buck Pruitt's desk, drinking weak coffee from a heavy white mug. Earl Dobbs was downstairs in the truck. The leather portfolio was on the desk between them. "Walk me through it," Cy said. Buck Pruitt walked him through it. The 1922 lease, the 11 renewals, the current lease, the boilerplate, which Buck Pruitt himself had typed on his father's Underwood for the 1957 renewal, because Marcus Sutterfield had died in 1956, and Cy had inherited the building, free and clear, the expiration provision, the absence of automatic renewal, the absence of holdover tenancy, the 13 days remaining until midnight, October the 31st. "What do you want to do, Cy?" "I want to not renew." Buck Pruitt looked at him for a moment. Then he reached across the desk, took a yellow legal pad, and uncapped his fountain pen. Notice of non-renewal. Certified mail to Lone Star Hospitality, Incorporated, in Dallas, with copies to Brett Holleran as on-site general manager and to Calvin Bracewell as the original lessee of record. Reciting the lease, the expiration date, paragraph 6 on holdover and trespass, and demanding peaceable surrender of the premises by midnight, October 31st, sent today, delivered tomorrow. Send it. By 11 on Monday morning, Buck Pruitt's secretary, a 60-year-old woman named Wanda Eccles, who had typed every lease since 1957, was at the Pampa post office with 3 certified envelopes. By 2 on Tuesday afternoon, October the 19th, the certified envelope addressed to the Cattleman Steakhouse was on Brett Holleran's desk in his small office off the kitchen. By 2:15, Brett Holleran was sitting with the door closed and his face the color of skim milk and the lease termination notice in his shaking right hand. By 3, he had Lone Star Hospitality, Incorporated, on the phone in Dallas. By 4:30, he had spoken to the general counsel of Lone Star Hospitality, a man named Roland Fay, who told him in a very flat voice that this kind of problem was not something they liked their general managers to create. By 6 that evening, Lone Star Hospitality's chief operating officer, a woman named Patrice Macklin, was on a corporate beechcraft from Love Field to the Hutchinson County airstrip, with Roland Fay beside her and a leather briefcase between them. By 8 on Wednesday morning, October the 20th, Patrice Macklin and Roland Fay were sitting in Buck Pruitt's brown leather wingback chairs in his Pampa office. Cy was at the ranch. He had instructed Buck to receive them, but not himself. Buck Pruitt told them, in his slow, even panhandle voice, that the lease would not be renewed, that the premises would be surrendered at midnight, October the 31st, and that no further communication was necessary unless they wished to discuss the orderly removal of their equipment. Patrice Macklin asked Buck Pruitt very politely what it would take. Buck Pruitt told her very politely that he was not authorized to negotiate. Patrice Macklin asked Buck Pruitt very politely if there was anyone who could speak for Mr. Sutterfield. Buck Pruitt told her very politely that Mr. Calvin Bracewell of Comanche Wells had been a friend of Mr. Sutterfield's for 60 years and might be willing to convey messages. Patrice Macklin nodded. She drove the 40 miles east to Comanche Wells, found Calvin Bracewell at his home on Brown Street, and asked him very politely if he would drive out to the Sutterfield Ranch that afternoon and ask Cy to listen. Calvin Bracewell, age 71, who had been a pallbearer at Iola Sutterfield's funeral in June of 1969, who had walked Cy out of the church on his right arm because Cy had not been able to walk straight that morning, said he would think about it. Calvin Bracewell drove out to the Sutterfield Ranch at 3 that Thursday afternoon, October the 21st. Earl Dobbs led him through the gate. Calvin sat at the oilcloth-covered kitchen table where Cy and Iola had taken every meal of their married life. Rosalva Ortega brought him coffee. Cy sat across from him in Iola's chair. Cy. Calvin, they sent a woman to me. I know. Cy, I'm not here for them. I'm here for the steakhouse. I know. Otis would not have done what they did Saturday. I know that too. There was a long silence. The wind moved the lace curtain. What would it take, Cy, for the renewal? Cy laid down 4 conditions on the oilcloth in the order he had thought them through over Sunday night, and Monday morning and Tuesday afternoon and Wednesday in the barn with Earl. First, Brett Holleran and Caroline Holleran were to be removed from the Cattleman Steakhouse by close of business Friday, October the 29th, in writing. Lone Star Hospitality could redeploy them anywhere it pleased outside of Hutchinson County. Second, the printed dress code and the brass frame inside the front door was to be taken down immediately and permanently. Coats, jackets, and ties were welcome. Workshirts were welcome. Boots were welcome. Stetsons were welcome. The Cattleman Steakhouse was to be open to any man and woman who could pay the bill in cash. Third, the original 1922 menu items. The rib eye, the chicken fried steak with cream gravy, the chili, the buttermilk biscuits, the peach cobbler were to be restored to the menu permanently and listed in their original 1922 names. The Houston wine list could remain. The oysters Rockefeller could not. Fourth, Calvin Bracewell, age 71, was to come out of retirement and resume operational control of the dining room and kitchen with the title of manager for as long as he was willing and able. Lone Star. Hospitality could retain its passive minority interest. Calvin would have full discretion on staffing, on menu, and on the framed photographs that had been in the storage closet since May. If those 4 conditions were met, Cy would renew the lease at the same rent of $310 a month for another 5 years, on the same boilerplate Marcus Sutterfield had typed in 1927. Calvin Bracewell, sitting in Iola's kitchen, reached across the oilcloth and put his right hand on top of Cy's right hand for 1 moment. Then he stood up, put on his hat, drove the 22 miles back to Comanche Wells, and at 6 o'clock that Thursday evening telephoned Patrice Macklin in her room at the Coronado Inn in Pampa and read her the 4 conditions off a piece of folded yellow paper he had written them on in Cy's kitchen. Patrice Macklin asked for 48 hours. She got them. At 11 on Friday morning, October the 29th, the Hollerans received termination letters delivered in person by Roland Fay in the kitchen office of the Cattleman Steakhouse. Brett Holleran threatened to call counsel. Roland Fay, who had practiced commercial law in Dallas for 26 years before joining Lone Star Hospitality, looked at him over the top of his half-moon reading glasses and said 1 sentence in a voice that was not unkind. "You have 90 minutes to be out of the building." The Hollerans were out of the building by 1. They were out of Hutchinson County by Sunday. At 3 on Friday afternoon, the printed dress code in the brass frame inside the front door of the Cattleman Steakhouse came off the wall by the hand of May Crocker, 66, head waitress since 1938, who had been telephoned that morning by Calvin Bracewell and asked very politely if she would do him the honor. At 5 on Friday afternoon, the framed 1922 opening day photograph came out of the storage closet behind the kitchen and went back up on the west wall over the back booth, hung by Calvin Bracewell himself, standing on a borrowed stepladder, while May Crocker held the bottom corner straight. At 7 on Friday evening, the framed 1922 handshake photograph of Otis Bracewell and Marcus Sutterfield came out of the storage closet and went back up on the wall by the front door. At 10 on Saturday morning, October the 30th, a new 5-year lease, dated November the 1st, 1976, was hand-delivered to Buck Pruitt's office in Pampa by Calvin Bracewell. It was typed on a single page of bond paper on Calvin Bracewell's own father's old Underwood typewriter on the same boilerplate Marcus Sutterfield had drafted in 1927. The rent was $310 a month. The lesser line was blank. The lessee line was signed Calvin Bracewell in fountain pen. By 6 on Sunday evening, October the 31st, 1976. The night the old lease expired by operation of law at midnight. The night that was Halloween. The night the high plains wind was moving the cottonwoods on the west side of Cuyler Street, and the gas lamps in the windows of the Cattleman Steakhouse were burning soft yellow. Cyrus Sutterfield walked the half block from the angle parking on Cuyler Street to the brick storefront at 312 Cuyler in his late father's gray wool vest and his good silver belly Stetson and his faded blue chambray workshirt that Iola had given him for his 50th birthday on a Sunday afternoon in Pampa in May of 1952. The sun was 3 minutes from setting behind the grain elevator at the west end of Cuyler Street. The light through the wavy old glass of the steakhouse front windows was the color of poured honey. Calvin Bracewell was at the door. "Cy." "Calvin." "Back booth." Back booth. Calvin Bracewell walked him through the vestibule, under the brass bell on its chain, past the framed 1922 handshake photograph on the wall by the front door, into the long dining room with the gas lamps and the checkered tablecloths and the framed Texas brand certificates on the walls, all the way to the back booth on the west wall, under the framed 1922 opening day photograph that had been hung that afternoon by May Crocker on a borrowed stepladder. May Crocker was waiting at the booth with a white coffee cup in her right hand and a small white plate in her left. The plate held a single warm buttermilk biscuit. "Cy." "May." "It's good to see you in this booth, Cy." "It's good to be seen in it, May." He sat down on Iola's side of the booth, by the wall, where he could tip his eyes up and see the framed photograph above his head. May poured the coffee. May took his order. The ribeye, the chicken fried gravy on the side, the cobbler at the end, without writing it down, because she had been taking it without writing it down for 26 years. In the front-of-house ledger, in Calvin Bracewell's hand, the table number for the back booth on the west wall was marked Sutterfield, reserved, every third Saturday in October, in perpetuity. At 3 minutes past 7, Cyrus Sutterfield owned the kitchen by sundown. He owned the building outright, as he had since his father's death 20 years earlier. He owned, by virtue of 4 conditions written on a piece of yellow paper at his late wife's kitchen table on a Thursday afternoon. The working operation of the Steakhouse for the next 5 years and beyond. He owned the menu. He owned the dress code. He owned the booth. He ate slowly. He drank 2 cups of coffee. He let May Crocker bring him a second helping of cobbler because she insisted, and because the cobbler was on the menu again. He paid the bill in cash from the small leather billfold his father had given him in 1939. He left an enormous tip on the table for May, and a second equal one in an envelope marked "Kitchen for the Cooks." He stood up. He put on his hat. Calvin Bracewell walked him out under the brass bell. Sigh. Calvin. Eola would have eaten the second cobbler, too. Cy smiled, very small, for the first time in 15 days. She would have eaten 3. He drove the 22 miles east in the long October dark. He did not turn at the home place road. He drove the additional 2 miles north to the Comanche Wells Methodist Cemetery, where Eola Wesley Sutterfield was buried under a flat granite stone alongside Marcus and Edith Sutterfield and their parents and grandparents. He stood at her stone in his late father's wool vest and his good Stetson and his faded blue chambray workshirt. The cottonwoods at the edge of the cemetery were going pale yellow. The panhandle wind was moving them. He laid his right hand flat on the top of the granite. Eola! He stood for a long time. They wouldn't seat me 2 Saturdays back. He stood for a longer time. It's done. Calvin's back. The picture's back. The cobbler's back. May set the booth tonight. I sat on your side and looked up at the picture the way we used to. He stood until the wind began to bite through the chambray at the elbow. I'm coming home now. He drove the 2 miles south and the 20 miles east and pulled the C-20 into the gravel turnaround at the home place at 9:45. The kitchen light was on. Earl Dobbs and Rosalva Ortega were at the table. Rosalva had a pot of coffee on the stove. She poured 3 cups. Then, because she was Rosalva and because she had been with the Sutterfields since 1957 and had loved Eola too, she poured a 4th and set it at Iola's place across from Cy. Cy hung his hat on the peg by the back door. He sat down at the head of the table. He picked up his cup. He held it a few inches above the oilcloth. To my father, who built that building in 1908. Earl Dobbs and Rosalva raised theirs. To Otis Bracewell, who shook my father's hand in 1922. They raised them again. To Calvin, who came back. They raised them again. To May Crocker, who set the booth. They raised them again. To Eola. The 4th cup sat steaming on the oilcloth at her place. Earl Dobbs and Rosalva Ortega held theirs in the air a long moment. To Eola, Earl said. To Eola, Rosalva said. They drank. And that, friends, that is the story of how the Cattleman Steakhouse on Cuyler Street in Comanche Wells, Texas, wouldn't seat a 74-year-old cattleman in his late wife's chambray workshirt on the 3rd Saturday in October of 1976, and how 15 days later, at 3 minutes past 7 on a Sunday evening at the end of October, the cattleman walked back through the front door under a brass bell that had been hung in 1922, sat down in the back booth on the west wall under the photograph of opening day, and ate his anniversary supper with the cobbler restored, the menu restored, the dress code gone, the framed handshake of his father, and the founder back in its place by the door, and the booth marked in the ledger in perpetuity. The shirt is still in the wardrobe in the bedroom at the home place. The wool vest is still folded in the cedar drawer, And every third Saturday in October, until he's no longer able, Cyrus Sutterfield drives the 22 miles west to Comanche Wells, walks under the brass bell, and sits on his wife's side of the back booth. And that, friends, that is the story.